told me that your love would never run out. You know I give my all to you, but you run out. I know you see the missed calls, but you better leave me like that. Close as your paper, guess we really was close like that. I saw you as my own.
Hello, and welcome to my first video in my Intro to Spirituality series. So, I've been wanting to make this series for quite a while because, I've spent a lot of time learning about spirituality over the past 10, 15 years, and I find that it's still quite a misunderstood topic. I think it's still quite a taboo topic in the world, and a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what spirituality is. A lot of people associate spirituality with astrology or, being very wooey or, just believing in make believe. And I think it's a real shame how sort of biased the Western world is towards a purely empirical view of our understanding of the material world, because there's just simply no way that any of us can grasp what is really going on with the nature of consciousness or reality. And rather than try to convince anyone about why spirituality is real or if they should, absolutely believe in spirituality, I'd like to try to present some very simple concepts about spirituality that can help someone that might be interested in, deepening their understanding of themselves, of working with their life in a unique way, in a way that will allow them to hopefully get in touch with their true self. This is a bit of a complex term, but I won't get too into it. Because I've found that spirituality can be an absolute gift. It can be a truly beautiful way of relating to yourself and the world. And it can be very freeing in a way from some of the trappings of the mind, from some of the ways that the world pulls us into egoic desire or materialistic desire. And what I've really found is that when you align with your spiritual self and the spiritual world, you can experience a tremendous amount of peace and love and joy and gratitude. And there is another side of spirituality which I would be I think I would do a disservice not to mention, which is spirituality is not all about love and light either, which I think is another misconception. And I think in the spiritual community, there's some forms of spiritual bypassing that can happen where people get so obsessed with the love and light that they almost reject anything that's not positive or good vibes. And that is another egoic trap. But again, I'm starting to get into these very complicated words. Like I said, what I'm attempting to do in this series and what I would like to do is to try to present some very basic and simple understandings and perspectives on spirituality that might allow you to engage in your life in a more deeper way, and to understand who you truly are, what you truly want out of life, and deepen your understanding of yourself and reality. Because it can be very confusing to know who we are, what we want, because it feels like who we want, what we want, and who we are kind of being explained to us by media, culture. A lot of people are trying to tell us what we should want, and then there's sort of different parts to ourselves that are constantly pulling us in different directions, and it can be very confusing to try to work through what is my true self, what is a healthy want versus an unhealthy one. So, yeah, in this series, I'm going to attempt to present some frameworks that can hopefully help guide you in some of these questions and guide you towards making the right decisions and taking the right life paths that are in alignment with your highest self or your highest good. So, yeah, for episode one, the first concept I want to introduce from spirituality is a concept I learned years ago that I have continually come back to because I just find it so practical and it has so many dimensions that are so helpful and so useful in understanding the world and ourselves. And that concept or idea is the map of consciousness, which was developed by David R Hawkins, who's a writer or a researcher. He wrote some amazing books like Power vs. Force, Letting Go. Just an amazing researcher and writer. And David Hawkins presented this concept, which is the map of human consciousness. And it's really fascinating because basically what David Hawkins has done is he's mapped all human emotions on different levels of a scale. So, and this is where spirituality and quantum physics intersect because in quantum physics, we know that on some level, everything is made up of energy. It's made up of particles and subatomic particles that are all vibrating. One of the most fascinating things that we understand about matter is that most of matter, I think 90% or maybe even 98% of matter is just space, which is mind blowing to think about. And there's quite a lot of correlations and connections between quantum physics and spirituality. That's sort of where spirituality does touch on a more scientific, empirical aspect of our understanding. But this map of human consciousness is fascinating because it basically outlines that all human beings in some level are energy. You know, this is in popular culture where we hear people say there's a certain vibe to a place or this person has a certain vibe. And, you know, it's very true. Every place, person, environment, it has a certain vibe. It has a certain vibrational signature. It has a certain energy signature. And every person has a certain unique energy signature. And the map of human consciousness basically shows that energy is all vibrating at different levels or speeds. And why this is interesting is because it paints a picture of all human emotions. And it shows that, you know, emotions like shame, guilt, grief, desire, you know, in this scale, they're represented as quite low on the scale. So they're lower vibrational states. And then as you go higher, you know, you get into, you know, neutral states, neutrality, and then acceptance. And then as you go higher, you get even higher to reason, love, joy, peace. And the highest level that you can reach on this scale is enlightenment or unconditional love. And this is a state that, you know, only a few human beings have claimed to have reached, or beings on this earth like Jesus and the Buddha and, you know, Mother Teresa, Gandhi. They've reached these extremely high levels of, you know, spiritual enlightenment or consciousness, right? So what I find fascinating about this scale is a few things. One, I think that it's really useful for many people to understand their emotions and their life experience in terms of this scale, not because you should believe that this scale is exactly how things work, but it will allow you to somewhat separate yourself from your experience. So if you ever experience shame or guilt or fear, you can understand that that's not who you are. That's just a state you are in. And when you are making decisions and you are enwrapped in shame or guilt, you can understand that that's not necessarily the most accurate state to reflect your more neutral self. So when you are in a state of shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, these are the lower vibrational states, and they are considered survival states. Okay, these states are considered that your being is in a state of contraction, not expansion. As you get higher, you reach a point of neutrality, and then eventually you reach a point of expansion, which is in the more positive states. And there's a few things I want to really point out about some of these states. First of all, shame is the lowest state a human being can be in, which is absolutely fascinating. And shame is such a misunderstood emotion that I'm going to dive into much deeper in later videos. Above shame is guilt. And then above guilt is apathy, which is like you just don't feel anything. And I think a lot of people mistake almost this sense of enlightenment for apathy. It's like they just don't feel anything, so they feel so carefree. It's like, no, you're not enlightened, you're just apathetic, right? Above apathy is grief. So grief, you're grieving. Um, and sorry, I had to answer a call from Enterprise there. But as I was saying, shame is the lowest human emotion, which is fascinating, right? And I'm going to get into this in later videos. Then you get into guilt, apathy, and I was saying apathy, it's just basically you feel nothing. And then grief, obviously when you're grieving, you're I've heard a saying that grief is love with nowhere to go, which is quite a beautiful phrase and sentiment. And those are like the really low states. When you're in those states, you just feel, really, really down on yourself. And it's hard to see hope in those states. You don't see possibility, you don't see hope. And that's what I find so fascinating about these states, is that our decisions and the way we see the world are often dictated by these emotional states we're in. And I think a lot of people just don't have a very um, clear understanding of that process. But then we get into fear, desire, anger, and I want to note here that notice how low desire is as well. So when we're scrolling social media on Instagram, or a lot of the media, the mainstream media and advertising, it's operating on this level of desire, right? Which is like this emotional state of like craving and disappointment, and it's not really a positive state to be in. But a lot of people desire is a higher level than, if they're operating from shame or guilt or apathy. So being in a state of desire actually brings people up a state, which is why it's kind of addicting, which is just fascinating. And I want to touch on that as well, because, above desire is anger. And, you know, apathy. There's many people that are living on a level of apathy. They just feel nothing. They're overwhelmed with the world. Maybe they have trauma. And a lot of mainstream media actually transmits at the level of anger. So, sensationalist news, all this violence that's being reported. So, anger is not a good emotional state to be in, but it's a higher level than apathy. So, for some people, watching mainstream media and sensationalist news is a higher level than what they're operating at. So, it brings them up a level, right? And that's a fascinating concept. And again, I'm not trying to present this as scientific fact. What I want to encourage you to do is to listen honestly, intuitively. And if any of this resonates, that's what you should take on board into your worldview. And if anything doesn't resonate, you should discard it. That's a really big and important lesson that I would try to impart about spirituality and how I've sort of um, experienced my own spiritual learning process is through intuition, right? Your felt sense of what resonates with you. And obviously, you need to balance that with a little bit of objectivity. You shouldn't just purely trust your feelings when it comes to many things, but in many respects, you should. So take everything with a grain of salt, but all I'm going to attempt to do is present useful information that might give you a different lens or perspective of looking at things and understanding things, and in the hopes that, it might benefit you in some way or it might resonate with you in some way. So those are the lower, really survival paradigm states: shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger. And then you start getting into slightly more positive states, slightly more expansive states. You get into pride, and then above pride is courage. And courage is like the line between the negative states and into the positive ones. So if you can reach a state of courage with your being, that's a really meaningful process, and that's a really meaningful event. That you reach the level of courage, you take the risk, you believe in yourself, you take the action on something that you have wanted to do for a long time, but you were living in more of a survival paradigm. This is a really meaningful transition. So then you get to courage, and what's fascinating is above courage is actually neutrality. So neutrality is actually a very, very advanced state. For most people to reach a state of neutrality with themselves and the world, it's a very meaningful shift. It's a powerful process. And for me, I can add my own personal anecdote here. In therapy, a lot of things in therapy try to teach you to love yourself, right? And for me, trying to love myself has always felt very, very hard, and I'm sure other people can relate to this. And if we look at that in the lens of this scale, love is a very high state, right? And love is always much more complicated with ourselves than others. It's much easier to love others than to love ourselves. So love is a very high state. And and it's a difficult thing if you're operating on shame to jump to love. Very difficult. It's very challenging. It's like getting someone to go from deadlifting 20 pounds to 300 pounds or more, probably more like 500. So going from shame, guilt, apathy into neutrality is a much more meaningful and more realistic state to try to aim for, because you might not be able to love yourself today, but you can try to be neutral with yourself today. And one way I thought about this as well is sometimes when I tried to love myself, because nobody really tells you how to do that, right? Um, it just kind of felt like a parent that is like telling their kid that they're such a good kid when they didn't really do anything, right? Like it's like, well, I didn't really do anything, meaningful, that like, I didn't really overcome any of my fears or take action on these things that I've always wanted to, or overcome some of my insecurities or the things that have plagued me for so long. So sometimes I would be trying to love myself, and it would feel like it was that parent that was just, giving the kid a participation medal. And that didn't resonate with me because, I couldn't gaslight myself into thinking, oh yeah, I've betrayed myself for so long, and today I'm going to love myself. And, I'm not an expert on loving yourself. But that's just my own experience, is that it's very hard to go from these lower states into, love. So that's what I found fascinating, is neutrality is actually above courage. So once you reach courage, you can actually, reach a point of neutrality and objectivity in a way. And objectivity is a good word, because if you notice neutrality, it's the beginning of the scale that's in the section of reason and integrity. So if you notice, neutrality, willingness, acceptance are all operating from a place of reason and integrity. And how many people are operating from a place of reason and integrity? You know, I wouldn't say the majority. So this is really, really fascinating, because if you are operating from a place of reason and integrity, you should give yourself some credit, because, you actually are operating from a quite a positive and expansive state of being. And that's why this chart is so fascinating, because it kind of articulates some of these really subtle emotional realities about consciousness, and it maps them to something that is sort of understandable, and you can kind of see if you're making progress, with yourself and with your spiritual life and truth. And again, as you starting to see, now you're starting to see that spirituality just presents a very interesting way of understanding yourself and your journey, and how you're operating from a day to day. Are you operating from a like a survival paradigm, or a more positive, spiritual, open paradigm? It gives you a tool for kind of analyzing yourself, which I think is just useful. You don't have to believe in, you know God and spirits, and you don't have to get there. That stuff takes time. It's a personal journey, and nobody can. You don't want to force yourself into those things either, because you would be betraying your own reason and integrity if you were to try to jump ahead too quickly, and you might never believe in that. Everyone needs to carve out their own understanding of spirituality and this world. That's what the journey is. It's a journey of understanding yourself and your place in this world and your experience of this world. So then, as we get higher, you start to get into reason, and reason is operating, from this scale at a level of 400, which is really high. If you're operating at a place of reason and understanding, you're operating at a really, really high level. That's really meaningful. And if you ever have read a piece of philosophy or literature that's really deeply resonated with you, because you feel that it's speaking to you on some level of truth that you kind of have always intuited, and then seeing someone articulate it so clearly, you might have touched the level of reason when you were experiencing that. So it's a very, very powerful state. And then we have love at 500, one of the most powerful forces in the universe, and a deceptively challenging state and force to capture and maintain. Often we feel love in fleeting moments, with a puppy or with a dog or with a loved one, but to be consistently expressing and holding yourself in a state of love, very, very challenging. The world is not necessarily conducive to be operating at in a state of love consistently. And a lot of people also get very confused by love, because everyone thinks that everyone has an agenda or a motive for doing things. And a lot of people, I've noticed, are very uncomfortable with sincerity. People just can't handle sincerity. It's too much for them. So, you have to have these really nuanced understandings of sociology and anthropology and social dynamics and people and relationships to navigate things effectively. And then you get joy, peace, enlightenment. These are very, very high states. And, I won't touch on those too much, because we've all experienced joy in very fleeting moments. Or, maybe for some people, you see some people that are just seem to be operating on joy a lot of the time. And if someone's operating on joy too much of the time, then you start to think they're a little bit crazy, right? Which, again, it's just interesting to think about, right? If someone is like super positive and happy all the time, you're kind of like, okay, is something wrong with you? Right? That's the kind of world we live in. And there's a little bit of truth to that. Maybe the person is just ignoring large swaths of reality, ignoring negativity. And like I said before, there is an aspect of, spirituality and the spiritual process, where there is this element of spiritual bypassing, where you just think spirituality is all love and light. But spirituality, it's more about accepting the whole. It's about spirituality is about wholeness. A lot of what happens in the world these days is about divisiveness, right? You divide yourself from others, this group versus that group, this political party versus that political party, this country versus that country, this race versus that race. And even among yourself, mainstream media is constantly trying to divide you from yourself. This is wrong about you. You need to fix this. You need to change this. You need to improve this. You're not good just as you are, because that drives sales and growth financially. So there's a lot of benefit that comes from people being divided within themselves, and then people who are divided are also inherently easier to manipulate and to control and to let people play this game where we can pretend that we are all fighting each other when we really should be trying to come together, and work together and support one another. But yeah, I'm starting to get a little bit deeper than I would like for this first video. I just wanted to present this initial map of and scale of human consciousness by David R Hawkins. Like I said, take this with a grain of salt. Take what you do. Most if you want to be 100% empirically and scientifically accurate, this is not something verified by scientific communities. This is a spiritual understanding, which spirituality is inherently almost impossible to verify, in the empirical sense, which the Western world is so obsessed with, this scientific model and understanding of things that we can prove. Where it's I just think people just taking it a bit far, where we can't prove and we don't know everything about the world. So if we can only rely on the things that we 100% know about, I mean, I don't think I need to go too much deeper on that point, but all I'm saying is to encourage you to use your intuition, use your reason, use your integrity, use your own sense of understanding, and approach things with a healthy degree of skepticism, but just trust your own intuition and trust what resonates with you, what doesn't. Take what does. As with any material, any good book, there may be certain things that you probably shouldn't take onto your worldview, and then there's parts that you should, but that's the mark of someone that's wise and intelligent, is someone willing to have that critical thinking. That's the word I've been looking for. So just apply critical thinking. But I wanted to present this map and scale because I think it's just fascinating to see the varying levels of states that human beings can be in. And this might help you with your own life. If you see yourself as operating in a certain state, you can recognize that you are in a very low vibrational state, and this isn't reflective of who you actually are. This is just a state you're in, and sometimes we need help getting out of these states. So sometimes we need help from therapists and coaches and friends and community. We can't always get out of these states by ourselves. But I just want to encourage you that if you are, feeling really down or operating from shame or guilt, that's not who you are. That's a state you're in, and there's a ways of getting out of these states, and I'll probably cover that in another video of ways of supporting yourself to raise your level of spiritual consciousness. And I don't even like using those terms, raise your level of spiritual consciousness, because it invites this sort of I'm better, I'm more spiritually conscious than other people. It's not about that. It's just about trying to experience your life in a pleasant way and trying to be at peace with yourself. So I don't even want to talk about it as raise your level of spiritual consciousness. I just want to present this as a very fascinating way of understanding the world, understanding energy, understanding consciousness, seeing how when you are in a more survival paradigm, how you can be susceptible to more manipulation from media, or feeling bad about yourself and then feeling like you need to fix yourself, and showing that when you get higher and reach states of neutrality and acceptance and reason and courage and love and joy, this is in some ways a more honest reflection of who you are, what's possible for you, and to show you that there are these more expansive states that you can reach that hopefully act as a marker of your progress, and maybe points to aim at, or just an interesting way to understand emotions and reality and consciousness. Okay, I'm gonna continue this series. I hope to make more videos on these topics, because yeah, spirituality can be quite taboo, can be a bit wooey, can be hard to understand. I think for some people it gets a bit too witchy sometimes, even for me, right? I can't do a little too much of that stuff. So I'm trying to make this accessible and informative and non what's the word I'm looking for? Non-dogmatic. So yeah, I hope that you found this helpful in some way or insightful. And yeah, I hope you take care of yourself. Hope you have a great day.